When it comes to web app and API security, the choice is simple. You can choose Fastly's security solution that teams will actually use in full blocking mode, just like 90% of their customers. Or you can stick with costly options that you probably just turn off. You can get Fastly's all-in-one platform that protects apps everywhere they live, however they're built. Or departments can agree to disagree. You can go to securityweekly.com/Fastly to learn more. Or you can just wish you had. Disrupt Ops helps you find and fix cloud security issues fast. Getting bombarded with irrelevant alerts is frustrating. Disrupt Ops gives security and DevOps teams prioritized findings and routes relevant alerts to Slack or Microsoft Teams with automated response options that save you time. Finally, security is inside your workflow instead of in your way. Listeners can access the full platform free for 30 days by visiting securityweekly.com/DisruptOps. Looking to improve your web application security? Probly is reinventing web application security. Probly focuses on the vulnerabilities that matter, eliminates false positives with evidence-based scanning, and provides a simple point-and-shoot solution that is easy to use. Probly's thorough coverage ensures accurate identification of vulnerabilities in any modern web application or API. Improve your web application security processes by visiting securityweekly.com/Probly and start your free trial today. We discuss application security a lot on this show, and we know that the implications for code security have become even greater as cloud adoption accelerates software development. Shift Left bridges the gap between security teams and developers to find and fix vulnerabilities accurately from the source. Shift Left Core is an innovation in code security with industry-leading accuracy and speed. It combines next-generation static code analysis, intelligent software composition analysis, secrets detection, security insights, and contextual developer security education in one easy-to-use platform. Learn more and create your free account at securityweekly.com/shiftleft.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Tyler Robinson and John Kinsella. Security Weekly is ecstatic to announce that Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista in Florida. Call for presentations and early registration for Security Weekly listeners is open now. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to submit your presentation and grab an early registration price before it expires. Join us on June 10th at 11 a.m. Eastern for our technical training on insider risk to learn how to quickly mitigate data exposure risks. Then join us June 24th at 11 a.m. Eastern to learn how web application firewalls can help mitigate exposure in a complex threat landscape. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to register now. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And now we do actually have John Kinsella joining us this time. John, I mentioned it in our last segment. I don't think anybody noticed that that you were missed.
I saw some comments in Discord. I'm offended that people were excited to have Tyler here. No, seriously, glad to have Tyler here. It's always fun to have him around.
Glad to have Tyler here. Glad to have you here. And because we have quite a bit of news to go through. And one sort of, we'll maybe set the tone of a branded vulnerability. And this is one that I saw, but I think you beat me to the punch, John, about throwing it onto our show notes this week about miracles that would happen with the M1 chip on Apple.
Yeah. It was funny. I was worried that I wasn't going to remember this one after we had the week off and what it actually was about, but I'm actually remembering it. So this is it's an interesting little one. I don't know how this. I'd be curious to hear a story about how this one got through the loops. It's not really something we're going to be worried about people, at least yet, being able to actively exploit and do something interesting with. But long story short, let me talk about what it is before we keep yapping about the story around it. On an ARM CPU, on the M1s, I think also the A11, there's a weakness where they've got some protected registries. They're like 2-bit registries, like not trying to make a joke, it's a 2-bit registry, but the registry is designed to be used by really the administrative processes on that CPU, right? Modern CPUs have got different levels for, what's going on, who has access to what. But with this one, it was found out that could be accessed from outside of that. From a non-privileged level. So that basically would allow you to provide message passing between applications when it wasn't intended. So that's the issue. It's not something you can do like, an O-day remote attack and start like, stealing all the information. It sounds like it's sort of a slow pipe too, since it's 2-bit. But Miracle, blah, blah. What was interesting to me is just the name of the register, S3_5_C15_C10_1.
Rolls off the tongue.
I guess whoever created the miracles, they need to go and work for Apple and start giving them better names on their registers, I guess.
Yeah, this was the write-up was the more interesting part of this than the actual vuln itself, because the vuln, as you said, is really just a covert channel that technically does break a security boundary, but it's two unrelated processes that could talk to each other through this basically bit flipping. And so, nothing really big there. The write-up does kind of point out, it does conjecture that it could be used for user tracking or collusion between things like applications that are trying to do lots of user profiling. So maybe there's some type of remote risk scenario out there, but not a big deal. It is, we did throw it in there too because it's an entertaining write-up, and the author does do a little bit of railing against the hyping and naming of vulnerabilities. Which in this case, I'm always up for a good satire, and I would have loved even more punch if this was something named like MIME or something like that, M1ME, and didn't even have an underlying vuln beneath it, but had something else that was sort of why are we talking about this at all? And that poking fun at overhyped vulnerabilities. But in this case, legit vuln, pretty legit write up in the sense there's a good technical aspect of hypervisors, what different hypervisors are, and so on. So worth a good read, some good entertainment there. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, it just goes to show that the M1 is definitely getting some attention with the vulnerability community and what they're looking for. 2-bits is nothing to really write home about, and that's really hard to exploit. But we start to think about some of the side channel attacks and the kind of implications of the fact that there is the ability to do this. And, it's only 2-bits this time, but with people looking at it, that doesn't mean that the next one can kind of scoot underneath of the sheets.
Yeah, and I think you're quite right. A lot of the researchers are going to be focusing on where are the oracles that are going to leak information about either CPU state or internal kernel state, and that's what's going to get more consequential in the sense of cryptographic keys, especially anything around the trusted enclave or the trusted store, and similar to like how Intel's SGX has been poked apart and for all sorts of security reasons, so that it could attackers wanting to leak as much information as possible about what kind of key material or other secret material has been stored in there. So this will not be the first and only time we talk about M1 over the next year, I'm quite sure. Another thing that I think we'll be talking about over the year is protocols. This was pretty neat. It stood out on my radar because I love protocols, and this is about QUIC, RFC 9000, which for those of you who've watched 2001: A Space Odyssey and HAL 9000, we probably should be naming things 9000s just because of how they turn out, but that's a discussion for a different time. But in this case, it is a new protocol for HTTP 3 that will be layered on top of it. So it's basically some fancy UDP framing with with encryption built in, similar to the TLS 1.3 handshake, and a lot of great performance improvements that can come to the HTTP protocol, something that has been around for 30 years or so, and actually hasn't seen much innovation other than HTTP 2 that came out a couple years ago, but still isn't quite pervasive. So there's a couple other things to me that stood out that I wanted to talk about this, but I'm not sure if Tyler or John, if you guys are the protocol heads that I am and enjoy this. Oh, yep. That's the answer right there. So this is okay, John. All right, you said something. I'll throw it over to you.
I noticed this started popping up. We have those few articles around this that sort of came out, right? And I started noticing outbound traffic on one of my firewalls. And I was wondering if like something changed and they actually started using this. more frequently, but I think it was just a timing type thing. But yeah, you dug into this one deeper than we did, I think.
The other aspect I wanted to bring out of this too is that great, we have a new protocol. Fine, we'll see some hopefully not design flaws in it, but probably some implementation mistakes. But one of the things I did pull out was Cloudflare, for example, has an open source implementation of QUIC called Quiche. And what stood out to me for this is that they chose to implement it in Rust. So here we're starting to see the new internet, so to speak, with protocols that actually have a dedicated section called design or security considerations in it. So go to the RFC, check out section 21, and there they actually have a nice discussion about what are the on-path, off-path attackers can do. In other words, things like intermediation attacks, spoofing attacks. It's because it's UDP-based, they already have some considerations around anti-amplification, getting in front of things like request forgery attacks, even things like other denial of service, like what they call stream commitments. Think of these like TCP SYN floods or old school TCB exhaustion, tables, or even just slow loris attacks. So what's nice is that the protocol has actually built on the history of design weaknesses and flaws that have come up over the past decades or so, and they've thrown that into the RFC as first principle considerations. The other thing now, too, is I'm circling back to that Rust mention, is that Rust will potentially see fewer of those memory and buffer and boundary overflow conditions within these implementations. So any type of protocol with framing can have fragmentation or framing, intentionally misframed items in the way that a adversarial client is trying to send traffic to a server. So I'm just kind of mentioning that as kind of a cool meta conversation, if you will, about just implementation decisions for teams choosing to say, we're going to implement this in Rust rather than continue perhaps the sins of the past in C. So that is my long way of saying that, yes, there can be something here that's interesting and relevant to application security. Tyler, take it away.
I think this is a great kind of point that is going to be coming up more and more as we start to see some of these new RFCs, some of these new developments, right, where development teams are going to look at and consider maybe the C application they've been using and having to fix, use after free bugs for the last 10 years. They're going to start taking into consideration, we're going to start seeing a lot of security impact around full redesigns where they're using maybe a more modern framework like Rust and some of these new protocols that are going to be leveraged not only by the application and take advantage of some of the security and performance things, but also at the edge when you start to talk about things like CDNs and their ability to pass traffic or prioritize things, or even some of the more advanced features for APIs and WAFs, like we talked on the last segment. Fastly's got a whole thing with QUIC's RFC that they've put out for a blog. So I think there's a ton of value in what is going to happen from a security standpoint, just from the bleed off benefit of adopting and seeing the adoption of newer technologies for perhaps performance or features that they're going to start using.
Yeah, and I think that kind of like the Rust plus boring SSL, these are forward-thinking design choices rather than a C-based implementation plus cranky old OpenSSL. I pulled in another article just briefly, mostly because I loved the title of it, which was, what was it? TLS session caching disaster. And this is not really that big a deal, honestly. It's a vulnerability that could potentially lead to an RCE within curl, but pointed out just for couple of reasons. One, Daniel Stenberg also had a great write-up and a link to some great background information on HTTP3. So I encourage listeners, if you're interested in that, in the new protocol, go check out his links and in the documentation that he's developed over the 3 or 4 years as he's been watching QUIC and HTTP3 evolve. But the other thing, too, is that curl is clearly a well-regarded, well-loved, well-maintained, and honestly high-quality software. And yet, Tyler, to your point, it's still running into the occasional memory unsafety issues. And this is something that has lots of developers, a dedicated maintainer who's curated it for quite a long, I think it's 15 years old. I can't quite remember, but well over a decade, and still running into a couple mistakes. So this is not in the sense of blame the developer. It's more of even great developers are going to make these types of C language mistakes and have these types of vulnerabilities come up.
How long do you think it's going to take for the adoption of some of these kind of new protocols? There's a lot of applications out there that haven't even taken up some of the HTTP2 adoption. So we're already on 3 here, and we're getting an RFC. But do you see that being widely and quickly adopted? Are we starting to see a progression in adoption happening faster, or is it still kind of the same old thing?
Well, I already appreciate that you used quickly adopted, whether the pun was intentional or not. But I will say that clearly the browsers are the front runners here, and the iOS and Android, because these are small developer ecosystems in the sense of Google, Android, Firefox, that are working on to bring in protocol support. But I think, to your point, the uptake is going to be a lot slower. And unfortunately, the reason I say that is if we look at the TLS 1.0, 1.1 deprecation just to get onto TLS 1.2, it took a really long time. We do have maybe some benefits with, as call back to our last segment, with CDNs like Fastly, Cloudflare, et cetera, Akamai, which we have an article on them as well, who can give you that edge-based TLS 1.3 or that edge-based QUIC support. But if your backhaul is going back down to HTTP 1, that's not really as great of a benefit necessarily. So it's going to be slow because it's the clients are out there ready, but the servers need to come on. And I think the one other thing that stands out to me is I'm curious from the pen testing aspect, how are these more framed protocols like HTTP2, HTTP3 going to make it more difficult for, honestly, what was back in the day a very easy protocol just to pick apart because it was so plain text and human readable?
I mean, from my standpoint, when I do pen tests, I probably do it a little different than a lot of places. I typically am abusing whatever function is being used within the application anyway. So I'm trying to mimic and or abuse the product in the way it was designed to be used. And thus, encryptions, protocols, adoptions of those things typically don't have the same ramifications. That being said, we're always looking for some of the traditional things to, abuse authentication or some business logic inside of how the applications are handling things. But again, a lot of that doesn't really get affected by the protocol or doesn't deter the attacker. So I think it's a combination. We don't want any of the old attacks or any of the denial of service or simple bypasses, use after free exploits. Like those things are kind of all common. I think those are getting to be less and less. When they are found, they usually are pretty severe because it takes a lot of effort to find them, and thus they're probably very deeply buried within inside of a kernel somewhere. But I think the abuses and protections for the application at things like the API level, like we talked the last segment again, those abuses where attackers are using them for something like validating credit cards or for testing authentication, we're using the application in the way it was kind of designed to an extent. We're just abusing additional features or creative features that we think of that the application can do. And so I think that there's going to be the same level of effort from the development and the security team's collaboration in order to build and design and think of a lot of those attacks and preemptively plan on how to protect applications against those.
Yeah, I think I'm going to use that. I think that's a great segue into one of the articles that was unfortunately just kind of a little bit fluffy about Google announcing new abuse research grants program. And this ties, the reason I was using that as a segue is that this Google, for about the past 3 years, they actually created a bug bounty for product abuse. And I think that ties in quite nicely to what you were just describing just now, and a little bit of the conversation we were talking about with in the last segment with Daniel about enumerating data or carding attacks. And I highlighted this just in the sense of call it a reminder to listeners, whether on the security side, the DevOps side, that your threat models should also include how can that application be abused? Not so much in the sense of the technical aspects, but just what are the what are the aspects of it when someone like Tyler comes by and says, "Huh, that's interesting," and just seeing what the business logic happens to. And I threw in just two examples of what I mean by this in terms of the Twitter tip jar privacy fiasco and the Slack Connect DM potential abuse. So don't need to rehash those articles. They're a bit old, but I just wanted to throw out this product abuse, which is I think, a good reminder necessary on top of things like the OWASP top 10.
Yeah, product abuse, I think, is much more prevalent than application vulnerabilities. Like, it's very rare that we use exploits. It's fairly rare that we break a web app in a traditional manner. It's much more common for us to find something like an API that allows me to write random data anonymously. Like, that's pretty useful. That's a C2 channel. That's a data exfil channel, especially if it's a trusted platform that is continuously used by a lot of places. There's those kind of things are ripe for abuse and will probably be abused very heavily. And you don't want that reputation damage. You don't want that extra load on your application. And really, you've got to make sure that your application is being utilized in the way that you designed it, because at the end of the day, you're paying for it. And the customers are expecting a level of effort and sanity on the data that they're using it for. So ensuring that those things are thought about. The abuse is, I think, a much more prevalent attacker base and attack surface that's going to have to be monitored more and more as we move forward.
Yeah, and speaking of reputation and product abuse, there's I linked to another article, Amazon Sidewalk. So they have a white paper on the privacy and security of their design. And this is similar in vein to the discussion you and I had, John, a couple weeks ago about Apple's AirTags. So here is a new product space that has, from the developer side, whether it's Apple or Amazon, some explanations of approaches to encryption, approaches to privacy protections, privacy preserving aspects, minimizing what metadata can be revealed. But definitely, but where am I going with this? Oh, but the volume here is, we're talking about, like with iOS, perhaps 1 billion users. Talking with Amazon Sidewalk, everybody walking around outside covered areas. So the scale of this has definitely become quite different. And the approach to how Amazon wrote their security white paper here is definitely, it's informative, but it's definitely a little bit more on the technical wonky side, where they're describing essentially envelope encryption, a lot of different encryption keys to how they protect metadata and minimize what kind of information might be exposed. But there's still a lot of either misunderstanding as well as legitimate concern from from an end user perspective about, what does this mean to me and what's this impact to me from a larger ecosystem, since I'm going to be surrounded by these devices.
Yeah, sorry. I just we've been talking about this stuff, and people can guess my thoughts on it. But I'm just quickly scanning. I hadn't realized there was a white paper in here before that Amazon has, which sort of goes to what you're talking about, the envelope encryption and stuff like that. So I think for me, this is, I'm happy to say I've got no Amazon products in the house, so I have nothing to turn off on this one. And it's partially because of stuff like this, right? I mean, think of this. I think the next analog that hasn't been mentioned on this one yet is when Comcast started doing this with their the cable modems, right? Allowing people to share Wi-Fi. And I think what's going to be interesting to sort of go a little bit back towards what Tyler was just talking about is not the direct usage, but can this allow you to basically use your neighbor's connection as a VPN somehow, right? What can you do to transfer traffic through this which wasn't intended, that allow you to be sort of covert in what you're doing? I think that's an interesting aspect of this. The thing itself, I mean, I think it's really similar to Apple, right? From that point of view of, it's a 40th of the bandwidth, I think, is the comment they make, of an average video being streamed. So it's pretty low cost to the customer. It's more about having something you bought suddenly being used for a purpose completely outside of what you intended it for. So that, I think, is going to raise the hackles from a lot of people. But It'll be interesting to see how it goes, right? I mean, it's the use cases that they came up with. The ones I saw a week or two ago was something about being able to allow seniors to have better access for their, I don't know, pacemaker or some crap like that. It was they were definitely trying to sort of tug on some strings of the hearts, but yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Technically, I'm a big fan of mesh networks. I like Wi-Fi mesh and things like that. But I think for it itself, it'll be fun to see how people manipulate it. I think that's going to be the fun part.
Definitely
the manipulation
be
is amazing, right? Like, I think the manipulation part of this is like what ends up bleeding out of this, what research hasn't been done, what air gaps haven't been jumped to get into your internal network from this. And then like the selfish side of me comes to the realization that no matter how this gets adopted, and like there's going to be limits and thresholds and things on this, but that still means that I'm sharing my internet, right? I'm very, very selfish when it comes to my internet. I like all the speed I can get. So regardless, I'm giving internet to strangers, and I'm providing them a pipe that's not going to change. Like, Amazon doesn't control my ISP's pipe. So there's a portion of this that I pay for the internet, and I don't really feel like giving that internet access out and having someone else use my pipe, especially when I figure out how to abuse this pipe. Like, that seems like a great covert channel that, I don't have to use my bandwidth for.
Yeah. And it's also, think about the way we're talking about this and Comcast. It's a very, at least I think to me initially, it's sort of an American concept of, this is mine. I bought this for me. I don't want to share it with my neighbor. So it'll be interesting to see where this gets used around the world. Like, is it going to be used more in Europe? But they're going to be more concerned about privacy and GDPR. Asia, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. I doubt they're ever going to publish it, but I'd love to see a heat map of this in, say, like 18 months.
Yeah,
I think you're right there.
Some of the aspects I was thinking of this too is more on less about that data sharing or connection sharing, bandwidth usage essentially, but more about where is the tracking humans, where is the potential stalking for this, or just of these are the few metadata leaks, so I can see who is where as they transit through all these sidewalk potentially connected areas. The other reason I brought this up is that there is a communication aspect here that, to me at least, I think is interesting. And on the show, past episodes, we've tried to talk about this aspect of communication and communicating security, even though as I'm stumbling over and not being necessarily coherent as I describe this. But in the sense of, here's a white paper from Amazon, and Amazon loves their 3 different names for the same service. They love their acronyms, and this white paper is full of them. So it's a way that is not, it's not opaque to necessarily technical people who understand a lot of the terms being thrown about here. But if they're trying to get ahead of call it the reputational risk of what should I be worried about in this isn't necessarily the right way to reach the audience of the more general user who just has that Echo or whatever other device that might be part of this mesh network. And I thought that was kind of an interesting exercise that you could bring back to your own security team to figure out, when we're talking about rolling out new requirements or rolling out new security, to either talking to our developers or talk about working with our product managers, and we're doing external marketing, external communication about the security features of our product. How are we communicating that in a way that is effective and presenting the threat and acknowledging the threat models that our users may have? And so now I'm going to have to poke Tyler and John to wake up from my interesting things and talk about communication and bring us back to some more technical things, perhaps. Real quick, before we run out of time, there was a small workshop that's very academic called a Workshop on Security and Human Behavior. And I threw a link to it, which was a link of almost 20 or 30 articles at the very least that were basically just background information about white papers that the developers presenting at this workshop had written about. And 3 I just wanted to highlight real quick. One was comparing the usability of cryptographic APIs. There was a PDF about security update labels, and putting security labels on IoT products. And there was another that was just talking about factors affecting the implementation of security and privacy practices in software development. And they're pretty meaty papers in the sense of, these are some academic PDFs to read through, but they're kind of interesting, I think, in the sense of reinforcing some common themes that we've talked about in the past. On the cryptographic APIs, they was basically emphasizing simplicity does promote security. They're looking at a couple different libraries and just saying, are they helping or are the APIs helping or hindering developers solving the problem they need to solve with encryption? As well. So you mean
envelopes inside of envelopes of encryption is not a good thing?
envelopes with if you're starting to get confused by your API, and did the API do make a informed and opinionated choice for you that you understand, that's possibly good. But did it just do something, or was it easy to misuse the API? Is really what's going after there. And it was kind of pointing out, OpenSSL versus boring SSL versus 2 or 3 others. I think Tink was another one, and just saying, I want to use that. If you were a security team to go to a DevOps team and say, use envelope encryption for this solution, it's probably not a good idea to just walk away at that point, because yeah, sure, that might be a great recommendation. But the details of that implementation and how you're managing the keys, rotating the keys, what the different keys mean are pretty important. So I think there is there is one other article here that I pulled out as a post-mortem from Akamai, talking about some things that might be familiar with Tyler, poking around just known vulnerabilities. This one was an example of, again, communicating from Akamai, a good transparent post-mortem about they were pulling in Lasso, a third open source library that exposed what was a new type of attack, at least to me, XML signature wrapping, that was essentially just a mismatch between the signed data that an application verifies versus the unsigned data that the application pulls out of that XML blob and is using within their business logic. So just kind of an interesting write-up in the spirit of a new vuln. We've talked about some authentication bypasses, authentication problems in SAML in the past, so I just thought this one was a neat one to throw in there.
I think this one right here is going to highlight something that we've kind of talked about for a while, and something I've been harping on. People don't realize the level of risk that this potentially could expose. When you start to talk about all of the companies that have went SaaS and or SAML, right, or OAuth or whatever one you're going to throw in there, and then you start to talk about how much corporate data, IP, intellectual property, discussions, even just sensitive information from a company standpoint, all of these things and where they live and how you do the authentication, something like this where you're essentially wrapping the authentication with inside of requests. I mean, we've been doing this kind of for years with binary signing and certificates for signing binaries. There's ways to manipulate those and even have collisions for certain signatures. So the fact that this is now migrated out to SAML and to SaaS applications and authentication, I think this should highlight the fact that you really need to take care of how you do your authentication, what data you keep in SaaS applications, how you have an approach for visibility and monitoring of all of these disparate technologies and platforms, because they're going to be abused, and honestly, they've been being abused for a little while. So keep your eyes open and watch what's happening.
Indeed. And I think that, this is also not something, adopting SAML, adopting these types of mechanisms are great because we can hopefully improve just the ecosystem around just raw usernames and passwords. And yes, an application that's mishandling OAuth tokens is still putting users at risk the same way it might mishandle usernames and passwords. But at least hopefully that loss of an OAuth token is constraining the blast radius, if you will, of that exposure to that single application. And we're not putting the responsibility on salting, protecting all these new passwords onto applications that possibly don't have the maturity to handle them as securely as they should. So still a fan of these types of federated authentication systems, just as you were pointing out, Tyler. There's a lot of nuances that need to be paid attention to. Did want to hit, as listeners may know, we definitely reach back into the history of the web, history of the internet. And I thought it was in June 2021 is 30 years after June 1991, when Tim Berners-Lee was working at CERN and was talking about the CERN HTTPD, basically the first HTTP server. So I thought that was a fun bit of trivia to help tie in and celebrate the HTTP 0.1, or it was 0.9. 0.1 was the version of the server and at the time in 1991, when today we're talking about HTTP 3 and the new protocol with QUIC. So don't know if there's any fun trivia you want to throw around the history of HTML or HTTP, but I thought I'd bring that into the conversation.
I was almost going to make a snarky joke about I saw that in your items coming up, the 1991. I think the W3's page on that actually looks a little more up to date than one of the other pages. I don't want to cast shade at people, but some of the other articles we've covered today.
That's possibly very true. So this was our whirlwind through this week's news. Want to just give a chance. Was there something we might have missed? Anything that we want to throw in there, Tyler or John?
I wanted to cover one thing really briefly. For both for Mike and I, and for a lot of people out there, over the weekend, Philippe Courteau from Qualys passed away. He led the company for 20 years, I think. Huge. Great guy in the industry. All the stories you've heard about them are true. He's I didn't get to spend a ton of time around the guy, but I still spent enough. And he was a very interesting fellow to watch and closely. When Qualys picked up Layered Insight, the first question he asked me at a boardroom table, one of the only questions he asked me was like, "What do you know about Qualys?" And I'm like, "Well, I've been using you guys for years. You've been around since the 90s, blah 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 blah." And he just nodded his head, good enough, and on we went. But great guy. Glad to get a chance to know him. I'm thoughts for all the Qualys family this week as they're dealing with that and moving forward. But just want to mention him. Thanks for mentioning that, John, too, because I spent 8 years at Qualys working on the web application scanner and worked quite a bit with Philippe on occasion. And this was the time, software as a service before software as a service was even coined. So definitely pioneering in the cloud and building up a great company and some great people that he worked with, that I worked with, that was around there. So will definitely be missed. And with that, I want to thank John for joining us. I want to thank Tyler as well for joining us this week. Thanks to everyone who's been quite active in chatting with us in the Discord channel. Thanks once again. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.